At its peak, the British Empire controlled 1/4 of the world, the strongest navy, the most powerful currency, trade routes that spanned every ocean. Britain didn't look fragile, it looked unstoppable. And that's exactly why it didn't see the danger coming. Because empires don't collapse when they're weak. They collapse when they believe rules no longer apply to them. The British Empire didn't fall because of one war. It fell because of one fatal assumption. And today, America is making the same assumption. Different century, different technology, same structural mistake. To understand where America is headed, we need to understand how Britain actually lost control. Not the myths, not the flags. The real reason. For most of the 19th and early 20th century, Britain wasn't just powerful. It was the system. The British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the financial capital of the globe. British ships controlled trade, insurance, and banking. If goods moved across the world, Britain touched it somewhere along the chain. From the outside, Britain looked secure forever. But internally, something dangerous was happening. Britain began to confuse control with sustainability. The empire kept expanding, not because it was profitable, but because it was politically necessary. Colonies weren't held for efficiency. They were held for prestige, security, and dominance. And that changed everything. Maintaining global control became more expensive than the empire admitted. Military bases across continents, naval patrols everywhere, administrative costs piling up. Britain didn't collapse suddenly. It stretched itself thin. To keep the system running, Britain relied on three things: borrowed money, global trust in the pound, and the belief that trade would always favor London. As long as confidence existed, the system worked. That's the key. Empires don't run on strength alone. They run on belief, and belief is fragile. World War I was the first crack. Britain technically won the war, but financially it was devastated. Instead of resetting the system, Britain made its fatal mistake. It tried to return to the old order. Same currency dominance, same global responsibilities, same imperial posture. But the world had changed. Debt was massive. Competitors were rising. And the empire was no longer self-financing. So Britain did what empires under pressure always do. It delayed reality, borrowed more, defended the pound at all costs, kept military commitments it could no longer afford. Outwardly, Britain still looked powerful. Internally, the foundation was cracking. And this is where the parallel with America begins. Because the most dangerous phase for an empire is not collapse. It's the moment when the system still works, but only by pushing it harder. Britain didn't lose its empire in one decision. It lost it by refusing to adapt, by believing that past dominance guaranteed future stability. That belief cost Britain its empire. And the same belief is quietly shaping American policy today. The British Empire didn't fall because it lost strength. It fell because it made one irreversible choice at the worst possible moment. Britain chose to defend its currency dominance and global commitments simultaneously, even when its economy could no longer support both. That decision changed everything. After World War I, Britain faced a fork in the road. Option 1, scale back the empire, reduce military reach, accept a smaller role in a changed world. Option 2, defend the British pound as the world's anchor currency and maintain global control. Britain chose option 2. This was the fatal mistake. In 1925, Britain returned the pound to the gold standard at its old pre-war value. On paper, this looked like confidence. In reality, it was denial. The pound was now overvalued. British exports became expensive. Factories struggled. Unemployment rose. But Britain refused to devalue. Why? Because devaluation would signal weakness. And empires fear perception more than pain. So Britain chose austerity, wage suppression, high interest rates, budget tightening. Not to help citizens, but to protect the currency. This is the moment the empire quietly turned against its own economy. Britain was forcing its people to absorb the cost of maintaining global dominance. And it didn't stop there. To keep control of trade routes and colonies, Britain maintained massive military spending. Bases, navies, overseas administration. The empire was now being funded by debt and confidence, not productivity. As long as investors believed in the pound, Britain survived. But belief has limits. The Great Depression exposed the truth. Global trade collapsed. Capital fled. Gold reserves drained. In 1931, Britain was forced to do what it had sworn it never would. It abandoned the gold standard. That single moment ended British monetary supremacy. And once the currency fell, everything else followed. Military reach shrank. Colonies demanded independence. The empire unraveled, not through invasion, but economics. Here's the lesson most people miss. Britain didn't lose its empire because it spent too much. It lost it because it spent in the wrong order. It protected the symbol of power instead of the foundation of power. Currency before economy, prestige before productivity, Control before sustainability. Now look at America. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. America maintains hundreds of overseas bases. Global trade, energy flows, and finance still run through US-aligned systems. And like Britain, America believes it can manage both forever. But the cost is rising. Debt levels are historic. Interest payments are exploding. Military commitments are expanding. Supply chains are fragile. Just like Britain, the system still works, but only because confidence hasn't broken yet. And that's the danger. Because once a reserve currency nation reaches the point where it must choose between protecting the currency and protecting the domestic economy, history shows what happens next. When Britain finally broke, the world didn't notice all at once. There was no single collapse moment, no dramatic headline saying empire over. Instead, something quieter and far more dangerous happened. The rules changed. Once Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, the illusion ended. The pound was no longer the unquestioned anchor of global finance. Trade began rerouting. Capital began searching for a new center of gravity. And power does not tolerate a vacuum. The United States stepped in. But here's the critical point most people miss. America didn't defeat Britain militarily. Britain handed leadership over economically. Because once a reserve currency empire loses credibility, it can't dictate terms anymore, only react. After World War II, Britain was still a respected nation, still influential, still armed, but it was no longer decisive. Its colonies knew it, its allies knew it, its rivals definitely knew it. Decolonization accelerated not because Britain wanted peace, but because it could no longer afford control. Now compare that to today. America sits where Britain once stood, but in a much tighter, faster system. In Britain's era, trade moved slowly, information traveled late, capital reacted in months or years. Today, markets react in seconds, capital moves instantly, narratives spread globally in minutes. That changes everything. Britain had time to adjust after mistakes. America won't, because the modern world is financially compressed. Here's what that means. When confidence cracks today, bond markets react immediately, interest rates spike fast, currencies weaken rapidly, political pressure explodes domestically. There is no grace period. And like Britain, America is already carrying the same structural load. A global military footprint, a reserve currency role, a consumption-based economy, and rising debt needed to sustain all three. That combination worked for decades. But systems don't break because they stop working. They break because they become too expensive to maintain. Britain learned this when interest payments and defense costs began competing with domestic stability. America is approaching the same crossroads. More debt now means higher interest costs later, tighter budgets, less room to respond to crises. And here's the part that matters most. Britain faced competition mainly from one rising power. America faces multiple. China doesn't need to replace the dollar. It only needs to reduce dependence on it. Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO. It only needs to raise costs. Middle powers don't need to challenge America directly. They only need alternatives. That's how influence erodes, not through attack, but through options. This is why the comparison to Britain isn't alarmist. It's structural. Empires fall when the cost of leadership exceeds the benefit of control. Britain crossed that line quietly. America is approaching it loudly, with debt debates, trade wars, sanctions, and global strain all visible at once. There's a phase every empire enters that is more dangerous than open decline. It's not collapse, it's not weakness, it's overconfidence under pressure. Britain entered this phase in the early 20th century. On paper, everything still looked strong. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. London was still the financial capital. The empire still covered vast territory, but underneath, choices were shrinking. Every decision required more money. Every response required more debt. Every crisis demanded more force. This is the phase America is in now, and history shows this is where empires make their worst mistakes. Why? Because leaders still believe power can solve structural problems. Let's look at Britain. When costs rose, Britain didn't reduce commitments, it doubled down. More military spending, more borrowing, more attempts to manage global order. But power cannot fix math. Debt compounds. Interest never sleeps. Confidence doesn't negotiate. By the time Britain realized it needed to step back, markets had already stepped away. Now look at America. The US still has unmatched military strength, still controls major financial institutions, still shapes global narratives. But the cost of using that power is rising faster than before. Sanctions used to be rare. Now they're routine. Military deterrence used to stabilize regions. Now it often prolongs tension. Debt used to be cheap. Now interest itself is a national expense. This creates a trap. When systems tighten, leaders face three options. 1, pullback arrow, risk looking weak. 2, compromise. Arrow risk losing leverage. 3, escalate arrow delay consequences. Empires almost always choose option 3. Britain did. America is doing the same. But escalation doesn't solve structural imbalance. It only buys time, at a higher price. And here's the brutal truth history teaches. Time bought with debt is never neutral. It always comes with conditions. Britain learned this when it needed American loans after World War II, loans that quietly transferred leadership. America may learn it differently, not through invasion, not through surrender, but through constraint, higher borrowing costs, reduced policy freedom, less ability to respond to shocks. That's how dominance fades in modern systems, not with flags coming down, but with options disappearing. This is why the world war framing misses the point. Empires don't usually fall because they lose wars. They fall because they win the wrong battles. Britain won World War I and still declined. Why? Because victory accelerated exhaustion. America risks a similar path if it treats every challenge as something power alone can manage. The danger isn't external enemies, it's internal limits. When an empire reaches the point where debt finances stability, power substitutes for trust, and force replaces flexibility, it enters the most fragile stage of all, still strong, still feared, but no longer adaptable. History leaves empires with one final choice, not between victory and defeat, but between adjustment and denial. Britain reached that moment after World War II. The empire still existed, the flag still flew, the institutions still worked, but the math no longer did. Britain faced a decision it had avoided for decades. Either accept a smaller role voluntarily, or be forced into one by circumstance. It chose adjustment, not perfectly, not gracefully, but deliberately. Colonies were released, military commitments were reduced, the economy was reoriented inward. Painful? Yes. Embarrassing? For many, yes, but survivable. Britain didn't disappear. It transformed. This is the option empires rarely take early, because it feels like failure while power still exists. And that's where America stands now. The United States still has options. But they are narrowing. The path forward is not about winning geopolitics. It's about choosing which pressures to stop carrying. That means hard trade-offs. Less global policing, more selective commitments, rebuilding trust instead of enforcing compliance, letting markets absorb truth instead of suppressing it. These moves don't look strong in the short term. They look weak, and that's why they're delayed. But history is unambiguous on one point. Empires that adjust early remain influential. Empires that delay adjustment lose control of the timeline. Rome delayed, Spain delayed, the Ottomans delayed, Britain barely made it in time. America's challenge is unique only in scale, not in structure. The modern world is tighter. Debt compounds faster. Markets react instantly. Narratives spread globally in minutes, which means denial is more expensive than ever before. This is why the real risk isn't collapse. It's miscalculation, pushing too far to maintain credibility, spending too much to preserve dominance, escalating tension to avoid admitting limits. That's how empires exhaust themselves. Quietly, gradually, then suddenly. The irony is this: America doesn't need to fall to lose its position. It only needs to lose flexibility. Once policy becomes reactive instead of strategic, once every choice is constrained by debt, markets, or credibility, once power must be used just to hold ground, the pattern is already complete. Britain's fatal mistake wasn't losing power. It was waiting too long to redefine it. That's the lesson history offers, not as a warning, but as a map. Whether America follows Britain's adjustment or Rome's denial is still undecided. But the window doesn't stay open forever, and empires don't get unlimited chances to choose differently. That's the real ending most history books leave out. Not collapse, decision, and the cost of postponing it.